All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Today's daf is Nun Chas. Well, before we get to that, thank this morning's sponsors. Thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for our annual Talmud Torah sponsor for Tafshin Pehei 5785, the Tilson Mishpacha, for dedicating Ovid Sherman Drushos as a zechus for besuros tovos for Am Yisroel. A week of learning sponsors: Berel and Rachel Galkin, in commemoration of Berel's grandfather's yahrzeit, Berel Ben Chaim, whose yahrzeit was this past week. Our Yomi sponsors: the Lasson, Spern, and Meystel Families, as a zechus for our father for a successful surgery and complete recovery, Pinchas Ben Bluma. We hope that in the merits of our Talmud Torah, all the Nashama Saf and Ali of the families in Nechama, and all of those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Choli Yisrael. The Kadosh Baruch Hu should merit Hashem continue to bring our hostages home and should allow our soldiers to be successful b'chol ma'asei yedehem. So with that, let us begin. Today's daf is Nun Chas. We are picking up on Nun Zayin Amud Beis. Nun Zayin Amud Beis, and we left off. Let's actually just pick up again with the TORAH Rabbanon. I know that we got a little bit further than that actually in the Gemara yesterday. The TORAH Rabbanon, if you see where Tosus Horaso. If you look at that Tosus there, Tosus is on the right-hand column. If you just move your finger towards the left, and about 2 lines down, you'll get to TORAH Rabbanon. So TORAH Rabbanon, Ish, Matal Lomar. Why does the pasuk say Ish? Ish, the Rabos Hasakusim, Shemusharin al Arayos Ki Yisrael. To teach us that Kusim, and again, remember, as I mentioned yesterday, in this context, Kusim is not being used, in the typical sense to speak about that group of people who had doubtful conversion. Thank you, doubtful gerus, but rather speaking about non-Jews. Saloch l'maisa again, the rabbos hasakusim shemusharin al aras. Sakusim ultimately again are subject to the prohibition of arayos like Yisrael. To learn it out from here, mehasam nafka leimor. We learned that out from leimor from the pasuk about Adam Rishon zegul arayos. So the Jewish Gemara answers hasam ba'arayos tido. So apparently there's 2 different buckets of arayos. There's arayos that a ben Noach commits with another, or the ben Noach, or the bas Noach, and then there's arayos that a ben Noach commits with the bas Yisrael. So 2 different psukim highlighting 2 different buckets of prohibition. The Tani Seifa Bal al arayos Yisrael. So let's say if a kusi, if a non-Jew has relations, let's say with a Jewish woman, nidon b'dinei Yisrael. Ultimately, again, he's judged in accordance with halacha. Lemay hilchasa. So what's the ramification of this? So it matters also because remember, again, we saw this in yesterday's daf, that halacha lemaisa, an eid echad, Ben Noach, it could be judged even by a dayan echad, 1 judge, 1 witness, even a karov. So halacha l'maisa, if he has an act of immorality with a Jewish woman, he is subject to the Jewish legal system, which again then has a basin of 23, regula eidos, hasra, so on and so forth. 1 second. Migra gara. So what you're telling me essentially is that if a Kusi, right, if a non-Jew has relations with a non-Jewish woman, right, immoral relations with a non-Jewish woman, he's judged by 1 set of standards, a lower set of standards. But if he has relations with a Jewish woman, he's judged by a higher set of standards, which essentially, again, remember, if you have Eid Eidim Hasra, that makes it much more difficult to convict. So it sounds like there's a lower level of conviction if he has immoral relations with a Jew than with a non-Jew, but that doesn't seem to make sense. To which the Gemara says, rather, no, what it's meant is a Nara Murasa. So Nara Murasa is exactly as it sounds. A Nara who has had Erusin but has not yet had Nisuin with her husband. So let's say the Kusi has relations with this girl. So interestingly enough, the Kusim, B'nai Noach, have no concept of Nara HaMu'urasa. I will say, this is actually quite interesting. We're going to see this come out a couple of times in today's daf. But in Ben Noach law, the only way to affect marriage is for a man to live with his wife. That's what happens. It's biyah. It's essentially, there's nisuin, there's living together. That affects marriage. And we're going to see gerushin means you no longer live together. That's it. It's a very simple construct. You live together in an intimate way. That's marriage. You separate from intimacy. That is divorce. So there's no concept of erusin. So therefore, technically speaking, if a kusi, right, if a non-Jew has relations with a na'ara ha'me'urasa, so technically speaking, there's no construct for that, for them in Bnei Noach law. So because there's no construct for Bnei Noach law, therefore again, in that case, he'll be judged in accordance with halacha. Fascinating. Ayva Tanya, Pala na'ara ha'me'urasa nidom eskila, alishes ish nidom mechanek. But one second. Remember that if a kusi has relations with na'ara ha'me'urasa, he gets skila. And by Isha Sish, by regular married woman, he gets chanek. Vi bedina didahu sayifu. Right, but ultimately, again, if halacha l'maisa, we're dealing with his halachas, so shouldn't it be sayif? In other words, remember, we saw yesterday's daf also. A ben Noach is always judged with sayif elas. First of all, I lied. Aron hachma yitzchak, my ishes ishtiktani. What's the ishish that we're talking about over here? So again, we're talking about a woman, let's say, went into the chuppah, but did not yet have relations with her husband. Now, in that context, as we just mentioned before, so a woman who goes into the chuppah but has not yet lived with her husband, in Ben Noach world, that is not marriage. That is not marriage. So because if there were an act of adultery to happen in that way, there is no construct for that for Bnei Noach. Therefore, again, Bnei Noach would be judged in accordance with our law. So we'll say, so this really gives birth to a very fascinating idea, that as much as there's a system for Bnei Noach, but if a Ben Noach commits an act of immorality with a Jewish woman, and again, that there is no parallel case that is prohibited for Bnei Noach, like Na'ara HaMu'urasa, like a woman who goes into the chuppah but has not yet lived with her husband. So in that case, a Ben Noach will be judged as a Jew. Fascinating. Okay, so the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, "The Tani Rabbi Chanina, B'ulas Baal Yesh Lahen Nichnas Al Chuppah V'Lo Nivala Ein Lahen." So again, here it's explicit. So Bnei Noach, B'ulas Baal. If a man lived with his wife, they're married, right? And if a Ben Noach were to have relations with that woman, that's adultery. That's the construct they have. But for example, but a woman who goes into the chuppah, so there's been kiddushin, but there hasn't been nisuin, or even if there's been nisuin, but Allah Almighty, the couple has not yet lived together. In Ben Noach world, that is not a construct of immorality that is recognized. So therefore, again, lest you think he gets off scot-free, no, he's judged in accordance with Jewish law. Quite fascinating. Tanya Kavasi Rabbi Yochanan, a bright says Rabbi Yochanan, Kol erva shebezdin shel Yisrael misalein Ben Noach musra leha. Any erva, right, that a Bezdin of Yisrael would execute someone for, a Ben Noach is warned about. If a Jew wouldn't be executed for such an act of immorality, then Ein Ben Noach Musra ala Divrei Rabbi Meir. Then a Ben Noach is not liable for it either. In other words, the one thing is like this: if a Jew isn't allowed to do it, then a Ben Noach isn't allowed to do it. But the reverse is not true. In other words, but if a Jew is not allowed to do it, a Ben Noach is also not allowed to do it. So the Gemara goes right to Chum say, Harbe arayos yesh she'ein beizin shel Yisrael misan alein uben Noach musar alein. There are many examples. Chum say many examples of misos beizin of arayos that beizin will not execute for, but yet a Ben Noach is still warned about. For example, ba arayos Yisrael nidon b'dinei Yisrael. The Ben Noach has what is considered to be in halacha, an illicit act of relations with a Jewish woman, he is judged in accordance with Jewish law. Jewish law, ba'arayos Ben Noach. However, again, if halacha l'maisa, again, he has relations with Ben Noach arayos, then nidon b'dinei Ben Noach. He's judged in accordance with Bnei Noach. Ve'ein anu ela nara murasa bilvad. And the truth is, when we try to figure out what's the distinction in all these cases, really what we're left with is the case of Nara Mu'urasa, or something similar to that, where in halacha recognizes that a marriage has occurred, but yet in the halachos of Bnei Noach, they only recognize marriage after it's been consummated. Okay? So in that kind of case, in the Ben Noach system of law, they would be let off without punishment. But again, Bezdin would hold them accountable. Why not also include the case of one who went into the chuppah but did not have relations with her husband? So again, this is the Tanat Ben Menashe. he holds that whenever Misa, remember we'll say some machlokes that we saw, that Bnei Noach, does Bnei Noach get Saif or Chenek? This is the opinion that says Bnei Noach get Chenek, and therefore Idi v'Idi Cheneku. Halacha l'maisa, the punishment for both of these infractions would be Chenek. Okay. V'sav Rabbi Meir, Kol erva shebeis din shel Yisrael memisin alein, aleh ben Noach musar la. So now, does Rabbi Meir really hold that for any act of immorality, that a Beis Din of Yisrael, right, the Jewish Beis Din, would execute the Yisrael for, Ben Noach is responsible for as well. So again, which means anything that is an arayos for us, on Ben Noach would be held accountable for. Is that true? Vatanya, but we learn about this is a very interesting case. Top of Nun Chas. Ger, Shahaisa Horasa Shalo B'Kedusha V'Leidasa B'Kedusha. So this is a fascinating case. Literally translated, a convert whose conception was not in Kedusha, but whose birth was. What's this case? This is a case of a non-Jewish man, non-Jewish woman who conceive a child together. Woman becomes pregnant, right? And then, over the course of the pregnancy, she converts. By the time she has the baby, she's a Jewish woman. So now, interesting enough, this baby is what's called his conception, was in Gentile kite, right? He was Shalo B'Kedusha. But by the time that he was born, ultimately, again, he's Jewish. So just to understand, what's the rule with this kid? What's the rule with this kid? First of all, the rule with this kid is that he's Jewish. He's Jewish. The interesting part about this is he has a halachic relationship to his mother, but of course has no halachic relationship to his father. Right? Because remember again, his Gentile father by the time he's born, so the baby is Jewish. So the Jewish baby has no relationship to his Gentile biological father. Okay. You'll see the manifestation of that right now. Here it is. Yesh lo she'er ha'im, ve'in lo she'er ha'av. He has relatives from his mother's side, but has no relatives from his father's side. Ha-ketzad. So we'll say, give me an example of this. So we'll say 3 lines down, 58, 8, and Chesed Aleph. Nosachosum in Am Yisroel. So if he married his maternal sister, he's got to divorce her. In other words, Ben Noach is not allowed to marry his sister, although we'll see, interestingly enough, that's a machlokes also. But for now, we're going with the approach that halacha l'maisa Ben Noach can't marry his sister. So therefore, again, if he did marry his sister, Yotzi, mina av yikayim, but technically speaking, if he marries his paternal sister, it's fine. It's fine, right? Why? Because again, technically speaking, halachically at least, she's not his sister, right? She's not recognized as his sister. If he goes and he marries his aunt from his mother's side, Yotzi, ultimately he's got to divorce her. Mina av yikayim, father's side, it's not a problem. Achosa'im mina em Yotzi, achosa'im mina av, Rabbi Meir omer Yotzi, v'cham omer yikayim. So interesting enough, what about his mother's sister on the father's side, right? So then again, Rabbi Meir says he has to divorce her, and the Chum say he's allowed to keep her as a wife. Rabbi Meir says, Kol erva shehi mishum she'er, Im Yotzi mishum she'er ha'av yikayim. Right? I'm sorry. Im Yotzi mishum she'er yikayim. Fine. So he says machlokes by that particular case. But again, halacha l'maisa, this is the rule. So again, baby was conceived in Gentile kite. Mother converts over the course of the pregnancy. By the time she gives birth, she is a full-fledged Jewish woman. The baby is a full-fledged Jew. We'll say, interesting, there's some interesting discussion about like, what is the status of the baby? Is there any element of gerus in the baby? So it seems the assumption of the poskim is the baby is a regular Jew, not a ger. Baby is a regular Jew. But halacha l'mayis, again, halachic relationship to the mother, no halachic relationship to the father. Now, of course, what's interesting about this is generally when a person converts, right, gershin is karka katan shenola dami, and therefore there's no real, relationship to either parent, halachic relationship to either parent. But of course, this case is different because the mother converted with the baby in utero, right? And therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, the halachic relationship to the mother remains, but no halachic relationship to the father. Okay, fascinating. Umuter be'eshes achiv ube'eshes achi aviv, and he's permitted to. This is talking about the ger, right? This baby who was born Jewish, who has no relationship to his father's side, but has relationship to his mother's side. Mutar be'eshes achiv, he is permitted to his brother's wife, or be'eshes achi aviv, or to the wife of his father's brother. Ushe'er kol arayos mutaros lo, and all other what would normally be arayos on the father's side are going to be permitted to him. Lasuye Eisha Saviv, and this comes to include even his father's wife. His father's wife. Now, obviously, in those cases, we're talking about where the people in question died. When we say, for example, he's permitted to his father's wife, it means his father's widow, right? Obviously, if she's married, even B'nai Noach have a construct of marriage. But again, normally these would be arayos for us, that even after these men would die, their wives would still be prohibited, but not for this person in question. Nasa Isha Ubita. So now, this is now switching gears for just a little bit. We're now back to Kusi for just a second. Let's say a Kusi married a woman and her daughter, right? The woman and her daughter. Nasa Isha Bita, Kones Achas, Umotzi Achas. So let's say, if you take a look at Rashi, Rashi is into intermediate wide lines, about 6 lines into the intermediate wide lines. Nasa Isha Bita, Ashar Gerim Kai. So now Rashi just points out we're transitioning back to just a regular conversation about converts, about Gerim. So what happened is very interesting. Ukishanasam biosam kusi, viniskairu imo. So we'll say, so let's go with Rashi's first interpretation. So you have a guy, he's just a kusi, he marries a mother and a daughter. So first of all, apparently the Gemara is telling us that whereas for a Jew, that's arayas, for a kusi, it's not. Okay, so the kusi goes ahead and marries the mother and daughter, and then interestingly enough, what happens? He converts. Or they all, Rashi says over here, Vinis Gairu Imo. They all converted along with him. Now here's what's interesting. They all convert along with him. Now technically speaking, what's the relationship with the mother and daughter after they convert along with the kusi? Nothing. So therefore, technically speaking, this relationship should technically be permitted. It should be permitted to remain married to both of them. But what's the halacha? The halacha is, the Gemara says, Konis achos umotzi achos. So halacha l'maisa, again, he is permitted to keep one of them and not permitted to marry the other. U'lechatchila lo yichnos. But ideally, ultimately, again, even the kusi should not marry the mother and the daughter. So ideally, don't marry such a situation like this. But again, halacha l'maisa, the kusi could remain married to one, has to divorce the other, right? And ideally, of course, not to get into a situation like this altogether. Supposed to say, so why does the kusi have to marry one? Why? In other words, why? Why? Technically, both women should be permitted to him based on the idea that Gershin is Dami. There's no familial relationships after conversion. So it's going to be supposed to say, so we have this kind of thing. The Gemara doesn't say it here explicitly, but it says it elsewhere. In general, it has to be that people can never say that non-Jews that you're going mikidusha chamur lekidusha kala. It can't be that becoming Jewish allows you to do something that you wouldn't normally be allowed to do. So normally, one can't marry a mother and her daughter, right? So the might say it can't be that through conversion, suddenly you're allowed to go ahead and marry a mother and her daughter. So therefore, the halacha says, decide which one you want to stay married to, and be motzi the other one. Okay? Meystel ishto. Ultimately, again, so listen to this. If his mother dies, if his wife dies, so Meystel ishto. So we'll say these are all cases. Ultimately, again, like we were talking about before, Meystel ishto, muter bechamaso. He is permitted to marry his mother-in-law. Okay, Vikadarmi, Asur bechamaso. Others say he's not permitted to marry his mother-in-law. Amar Yehuda lo kashya. Harabi Meir Alibud Rabbi Eliezer, Harabi Meir Alibud Rabbi Akiva. Okay, pointing out 2 different opinions as we're going to see right now. Desanya, Al Kin Yazov Ish Es Avives Imo. A man will go ahead and leave his father and his mother. So Rabbi Eliezer, this is talking about the pasuk. This is talking about the pasuk by Adam Arishon, by marriage. First, I'll take a quick look at Rashi. Meystel ishto. Muter b'chamoso, ve'afal pi shekaima leishto mishinis gayer, de ben Noach lo musra al chamoso, de nema bo'im mikdusha, v'chamoso mamish lo havia, Afagav dinis gayer, the gershin is gayer kakadevein karvos zelazeh. So this just continues the previous case, right? So our ger, when he was a guy, was married to a mother and daughter. They all convert together, one big happy family. So step number one is, unfortunately, you're no longer one big happy family, right? Decide who you want to stay married to, and the other you can't be married to anymore, because we can't have a situation where someone who's Jewish is married to a mother and a daughter, even if halachically one could somehow figure this out. However, the other familial relations are really dissolved. So therefore, again, let's say Ger's wife dies, he is permitted to go ahead and marry his mother-in-law, his wife's mother. Even though normally for us, again, that would be an erva. Right? Why is he allowed to do that? Because halacha l'maisa, again, upon conversions, all of these familial bonds were dissolved. Others say he's not allowed to go ahead and marry his mother-in-law. If you look at next Rashi, okay, so the Gemara says, so it's two different opinions. So how do we resolve this? This is the sign we learned in the Brisa. I suppose say this is the pasuk of marriage in the Torah. Therefore, a man will leave his father and his mother. He will cling to his wife, and they will be one flesh. That's the pasuk. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Aviv. So I'll say, so when the pasuk says a man will leave his father and his mother, so what does that mean? What does that mean? So the Gemara says, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Aviv is achos aviv, v'imo, and imo is achos imo. Aviv actually means the brother of his father. Sorry, the sister of his father, thank you. V'imo, and imo means the sister of his mother. The sister of his mother. So Rabbi Eliezer is coming to say that this is actually coming to prohibit certain arayos. On the other hand, Rabbi Kiva says, no. Aviv is eshes aviv. Aviv refers to the wife of his father. V'imo, and imo is imo mamish. And imo literally means his mother. V'davak, and he will cling. This is how the marriage refers to as clinging. V'lo bezachar. So again, the Torah says marriage is a man to a woman and not a man to a man. V'lo bezachar. Okay, Rashi is interesting. And Rashi understands of it, the way the Gemara understands it is because the Torah uses the Lasson of dibuk, of connection by marriage. So Rashi understands, interestingly enough, Rashi says over here that davak means an act of relations which creates pleasure. And whereas Rashi says that the act of mishkav zachar doesn't create the same type of pleasure. So it's interesting how Rashi understands that vidavak there. It's interesting because generally the way that the exclusion for mishkav zachar, for homosexual behavior, is usually learned out, ultimately again is usually from v'hayu lebasar echad, that marriage is a union which could technically produce offspring. That's the type of just organic relationship that is covered under marriage. But it's interesting, a different Joshua. I will say, just whenever we come across Joshua's like this, I always feel like it's incredibly, halacha is halacha. Halacha is halacha. And halacha never, halacha is immutable. And it doesn't matter what society says, what society doesn't say. The Rebbe Shalom makes the rules, and we don't. And the systems of morality are determined by HaKadosh Baruch Hu and not by us. Not by us. And so marriage is defined as in a certain way, and normative relationships are defined in a certain way. That's the halachic construct. From just a v'yahavta l'reacha kamocha perspective, and from an empathy perspective, there are all kinds of Jews. There are all kinds of Jews and all kinds of people. And the Ribbon Shalom creates people in all different kinds of ways. And it's just important to understand, if the Torah prohibits something, it means that desire absolutely exists within people, and it's real, and it's there. And especially again in this particular inyan, no greater struggle than for a man or for a woman who is struggling with identity, with sexual identity, and wants to live a life of halacha, but is often forced between a commitment to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and companionship. Struggles that those of us who don't understand it could never understand it. So that's why, again, the halacha is the halacha. Halacha is the halacha. But never think that the halacha in any way impugns upon the dignity of the individual, and never think that the halacha allows us to impugn upon the dignity of the individual. And an openness and a welcomeness applies to all types of Jews, and a love and an empathy applies to all types of Jews, even if we don't have the ability, any flexibility, to change the rules. The rules are the rules, but the love always has to be all-encompassing. The Gemara goes weiter. Be'ishto v'lo be'ishes chavero. So this is a good drasha, right? And the Torah says, "V'davak be'ishto." Cling to your own wife and not to anyone else's wife. The Gemara says, "V'hayu lebasar echad," and they will become one flesh. So mishenasim basar echad. This only refers to an act of relations where again there's a fusion. Yatsu behema v'chaya she'in nasin basar echad. So again, Rashi says over here, Mishnas shezer yotze mehem nase basar ha'im va'avach. So v'hayu basar means, again, they're capable of creating offspring. So again, this comes to exclude, let's say, mating, a behemoth with a chaya, where it can't create the basar echad. Okay, Amar Rabbi Lazar Omer, Aviv achos Aviv. Aviv refers ultimately again to a father's sister. Ema Aviv mamish. Maybe it means real father. So the Gemara says, Hainu v'davak v'lo b'zachar. So this ultimately again is davak and not zachar. Okay. So in other words, there's no need for the pasuk to prohibit relations with one's father, right? There's no need for that because again, that's covered under mishkav zachar, right? That's covered under the davak and not with the zachar. Ema Eishes Aviv, maybe it's referring to father's wife. Hainu be'ishto v'lo be'eshes chavero. So father's wife again is covered under the prohibition of eshes chavero, of your friend's wife. Ema la'achar misa. So this is interesting. So maybe halacha ma'aseh comes to say that father's wife is prohibited even after the death of the father. And again, I remember again, this is all b'nei Noach. So maybe he's coming to go ahead and say that a father's wife is prohibited even after the death of the father. Dumya di'imo. Ma'imo delav ishus. Af aviv delav ishus. Just like in the case of mother, ultimately again, we're not talking about a prohibition that is derived as a result of marriage. So too by father, we're not talking about a situation of a prohibition derived as a result of marriage. Imo. What's imo? Achos imo. Right? Ultimately, again, this refers to mother's sister. Ve'ema imo mamish. Maybe it's referring to mother herself. Hainu be'ishto v'lo be'eshes chavero. No, because mother ultimately again is the father's wife, so she's prohibited already. To which the Gemara says ve'ema la'achar misa. Maybe it's going to include even after the death of the father. Dumya da'aviv. It's comparable ultimately again to father. Ma'aviv delav mamish. Af imo delav mamish. Just like the father, it's not referring to the father himself. So to the mother, not referring to the mother herself. Rabbi Akiva says, Aviv Eishes Aviv. Aviv refers to the wife of the father. Ve'ema Aviv Mamish. Maybe it's the father himself. Torah actually saying a person can have relations with his father. Hainu v'davak below b'zachar. All right, that's already covered by a different prohibition. Ihachi Eishes Aviv Nami Hainu be'ishto v'lo be'eshes chavero. But again, if that's the case, then Eishes Aviv, father's wife, is also covered. Why? Because it says be'ishto and not with your friend's wife. La'achar misa. It's coming to include, perhaps coming to include the father's wife even after the death of the father. Imo mamish. Imo, maybe mother means actual mother. To which the Gemara says, Hainu be'ishto v'lo be'eshes chavero. But that would be covered under ishto and not eshes chavero. In other words, the mother is someone else's wife. Saloch l'maisa, again, it should be covered under that. Interesting that the Gemara says, Imo me'anusaso. We could be talking about a case, where a man violated a woman. She became pregnant from the act of violation. And now again, so the child, that son, is prohibited to his mother. Now that woman may not be his father's wife, but ultimately again is still his mother. Therefore again, perhaps there's a specific Torah prohibition to prohibit that woman. Let's say, you know what the good part about these Gemaras are? Right? You think your family has problems, right? I just want to point out, right? Suddenly again, all of your familial dysfunction seems to fade into oblivion when you begin to see the complex familial realities of the Gemara. So what are they arguing about? Rabbi Elazar holds, we'll say Amud Beis Elazar Savar Aviv Dumya Di'imo. Rabbi Elazar says that the case of father, Aviv is compared to mother, Ve'imo Dumya Da'aviv. And ultimately, again, the mother case is compared to the father, to which the Gemara says, and that case can only be found L'mashkachos Ela Ba'achva. The only case where they can compare is when it's referring to sisters, referring to the sister of the father, sister of the mother. Rashi says over here, the Tarvayu Mamish Lekka Lememar De'im Kain Hanivadav Below Zachar. Rabbi Kiva says, Mutav Lu'ukme Be'eshes Aviv De'ikre Ervas Aviv Lafuke Achos Aviv De'she'er Aviv Ikri Ervas Aviv Lo Ikri. Rabbi Kiva, on the other hand, disagrees, and he holds that Allah Lemaisa, it is much better to set up the pasuk as referring to or prohibiting the father's wife. Why? Because the father's wife is called an erva, as opposed to a sister who's not called an erva. A sister is called she'er, a relative. Now, practically speaking, they're both prohibited, a she'er and an erva. But again, halacha l'maisa, we're talking about cases of arayos, therefore we'd rather include the father's wife than the father's sister. Okay, Tashma. So we'll see some interesting Gemaras over here. Tashma. Vayikach Amram es Yocheved dodaso. Amram took Yocheved, his aunt, as a wife. So Amram married his aunt, the Moshe Rabbeinu's parents. Right, Moshe Rabbeinu's parents, right, Amram and Yocheved, were nephew and aunt. My love dodasa minaim. So must have been. So was Yocheved Amram's maternal aunt, right? His mother's sister. Lo dodasa minaav. No, she was a paternal sister, right? Because remember, Bnei Noach have she'er minaim, not she'er min ha'av. Tashma v'gam omna achosi bas avihi ach lo bas imi by Avram Avinu. Right, when Avram Avinu, again, when Sarah was taken by Avimelech, so remember again that whole story, she's taken by Avimelech because Avram claimed that Sarai was his sister. Avimelech takes her, and then when Avimelech returns her, Avram Avinu essentially says, listen, I didn't lie to you because she is also my sister, the daughter of my father. So the Gemara Darshans, what do you see from Avram Avinu's statement? Avram said, she's the daughter of my father, but what? Achlo bas imi, not the daughter of my mother. Nechlal de bas ha'im asura. Why? Because again, for Bnei Noach, there is familial connection from the mother's side, not familial connection from the father's side. So therefore, even Avram Avinu was careful to say, I'm related to Sarah from my father's side, which means we're not really related, which is why I can marry her. But technically speaking, there's a biological relationship, but no legal relationship recognized. So Gemara says, one second. Bas Achiv Havi, was Sarai Imenu the daughter of Abraham's brother? So the Gemara says, I'm sorry, Bas Achi Havi. V'chevan dahachi hu loshna min ha'av v'loshna min ha'em sharia. Ella, Gemara says, one second. But either way, if she's the daughter of his brother, then halacha l'maisa, the truth is, in that case, it actually wouldn't matter whether or not this is a paternal brother or a maternal brother. Ella hasim haki kamarle. Rather, what Avram Avinu was trying to say was as follows: Korva da achos isli bahada me abba v'lo mi ima. I have a relationship with her. I'm related. But so in other words, therefore, when I told you that she's my sister, I wasn't lying. I used sister in a little bit of a looser form, saying that we're related. And again, and our relation is from the father's side and not from the mother's side. So Tashma. So the Gemara says, because remember again, at the end of the day, remember that Sarai wasn't the daughter of Avram Avinu's brother. Right? I'm sorry, she was the daughter of Avram Avinu's brother, not Avram Avinu's actual sister. Fine. So Gemara says, so Tashma, mipnei ma lo nasa Adam es bito. This is interesting. Why didn't Adam marry his daughter? It sounds like a really strange question the Gemara is asking. So what the Gemara is asking over here is as follows. Remember, to go ahead and propagate the world, so a lot of different kinds of relationships are going to have to occur, right? Because there was a very limited human pool. So why didn't Adam marry his daughter? Kadei sheyisa Kayin es achos. So in order that Kayin, right, Adam's son, should marry his sister, right? If Adam married his daughter, then ultimately, again, Kayin would not have been able to marry his sister. Same person. So therefore, again, Adam Rishon doesn't marry his daughter. The Gemara says, "Shneimar ki amarti olam chesed yiboneh." Ultimately, therefore, I have said that the world is built on chesed. So I say, interestingly enough, the Gemara is attributing over here the fact that Adam didn't marry his daughter and left her for Kayin as an act of chesed. So technically speaking, which is fascinating on a variety of different levels, that this is called chesed. But again, perhaps on a certain level, halacha l'maisa, if you have a quote unquote right to something and you're mevater, you yield that right for someone or something else, that is called an act of chesed. It's also interesting to point out that, remember, the Torah uses the word chesed also to refer to immorality. right? It's fascinating, right? Chesedu, right? Immorality, which is, we mentioned this before, so why is the same word for kindness and charitability and for immorality? Because again, right, a person has a desire to express love to the other. What's immorality? Expressing love to too many people who you shouldn't be expressing it to. So there's this fine line sometimes between being a giving person and being too much of a giving person. So Lemaisa, it's just fascinating that etymologically, or just Hebraically, the same word chesed, which means loving kindness, is also the same word for immorality. Okay, the Gemara goes weiter. Halav hachi asira. Now, what do you see for halav hachi asira? So one second, but I don't understand that halacha lemaisa, what you see from here is, were it not for the fact that Cain had to marry his sister, because you want to talk about like a shidduch crisis, there was no one else to marry, right? There was no one else to marry. So lemaisa again, but you see, otherwise it would have been prohibited. So what do you see from here? That a ben Noach is not permitted to marry his sister. To which the Gemara says, interesting enough, Kevan de Ishtri. Now, this Tana is of the opinion that technically speaking, a Ben Noach could even marry his sister. And once it became permitted for Cain, it became permitted in general. Okay, Am Rav Huna, Kusi mutter bebito. Rav Huna says a Kusi, all right, a non-Jew is permitted to marry his daughter. Vim Tomar, Mipnei ma lo nasa Adam es bito. If that's the case, then why didn't Adam marry his daughter? Same Gemara as before, Kadesh Yisa Cain es achoso. In order that Cain should be able to have a wife and marry his sister. The Gemara says, Mishum Olam Chesed Yibana. The world is built on kindness. Built on kindness. And again, I will say that same yesod, that sometimes kindness is not even necessarily in what you give someone else, but kindness, chesed, is more found in the ability to yield. I have a right to something. I choose not to exercise that right. That's chesed as well. Vika Da'amri, our alternate version of this discussion, Amrav Huna, Kusi Asr Bebito. A Kusi is not allowed to marry his daughter. How do we know this? Teda, Shalonasa Adam es Bito. Because Vaharaya, Adam didn't marry his daughter. And the fact that Adam didn't marry his daughter indicates to us that a Kusi isn't allowed to marry his daughter. V'lo, the Gemara says that's actually not a good raya. Hasam hainu taima kadeshi yisa kaines achoso. Ultimately, that's different. The reason Adam didn't marry his daughter is because in order to go ahead and have Cain marry his sister. Why? Mishum da'olam chesed yibane. Incredible. So the Gemara goes right. Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says, Eved mutter be'imo mutter bebito. I was supposed to say this is a fascinating case. An Eved. Now again, we're talking about an Eved Kanani, owned by a Jew. Right? So now a Jew acquires an Eved. Now remember again, we've learned this many times before. Avdus is quite fascinating. Why? Because essentially the Eved kind of transitions into quasi-Jewishness. Remember again, there's a Tvila l'shem Avdus, there's a Mila l'shem Avdus, so there's immersion, there's a mikvah, he's chayiv in mitzvos. In general, except for time-bound mitzvos, he has a quasi-Jewish state. So as a result of Chisda says, and remember, and upon emancipation, he becomes a full-fledged Jew. So the Gemara says, interestingly enough, Eved mutter be'imo, he is permitted to marry his mother, mutter be'bito, and he's allowed to marry his daughter. Why? Because Michlal Kusi, Yatsa Michlal Kusi, Ulechlal Yisrael lo ba. So we'll say, because interestingly enough, right, he's no longer a Kusi, right? He's no longer a Kusi, but he's also what? Not a Jew. Because remember again, I will say this brings all of these Gemaras together, right? A Kusi is not allowed to marry his mother. This way he passes. Not allowed to marry his mother or his sister. Not allowed to marry his mother or his sister, or his daughter for that matter. His mother, sister, daughter, right? If a Kusi brother and sister, mother, son, father, daughter convert, they become Jewish. Technically, can they get married? Technically, yes. Technically, the answer is yes. But remember again, Chazal said, it can't be that people think that conversion is coming mikedusha chamur lekedusha kala, right? As a kusi, you weren't allowed to marry your mother, your daughter, and your sister. And now that you're a yid, you are allowed to. It doesn't make any sense. So therefore, again, it's interesting enough, the Eved is kind of in limbo. He's not a kusi because now he's an Eved, but he's also not a Jew because he hasn't yet been emancipated. So because of that, there's nothing to stop him from marrying his mother, his sister, or his daughter. So interesting, Ben Noach, who designated a shifcha for his servant. So again, you have a Ben Noach, a non-Jew, who has an Eved. He designated a wife for this Eved. And then again, the Kusi master had relations with her. So ultimately, again, Ben Noach master had relations with her. He's chayiv. The master is chayiv. Is liable for an act of immorality. Now me'emas. When is that? So the Gemara says, in other words, at what point in time does the shifcha become the wife of the Eved? So the Gemara says, Rav Nachman be the kari le revisa de planya. When people say about her, that she's the wife of so-and-so Eved. In other words, when people talk about this shivcha as the wife of the Eved, as soon as it's commonly known that people talk about her as Mrs. Eved, she's a married woman, and therefore, again, the Ben Noach would be chayiv for relations with her. Me'emas hasrasa, at what point in time is he considered to be warned about her? Me'emas hatarasa, at what point in time is she permitted? In other words, at what point in time is this shivcha no longer the wife of this Eved? Interesting. Amravuna mishepara rosha b'shuk, when she uncovers her hair. It's interesting enough, Rashi points out over here that apparently even non-Jewish women would cover their hair as a sign of marriage in some way during times of the Gemara. So once she uncovers her hair, she's no longer married. And I will say, and I remember again, it's what we mentioned before, that halacha l'maaseh in the Ben Noach construct of marriage, so the way marriage works is like this. When are you married? When you live together. You live together. When are you no longer married? When you don't live together. Or again, here the Gemara says, when the wife uncovers her hair. Once she uncovers her hair, then that's indicative that they are no longer married, and therefore she's no longer Eish Ish. So again, by Bnei Noach, interestingly enough, there's the construct of marriage and divorce, but there's no construct of Erusin, Nisuin, or formal Gerushin. Okay, incredible. Amar Balazar, both say third wide line. Ben Noach Shabal Ishto Shelo Kidarka Chayiv. Okay, Ben Noach who has relations with his wife Shelo Kedarka. Via Shelo Kedarka is going to be chayiv. Shene Emar, because the pasuk says v'dovak v'lo Shelo Kedarka. So interesting, the Gemara understands over here, this is fascinating. So the Gemara says it means v'dovak, clinging, which means a normative act of bia, and not bia Shelo Kedarka. So we'll say this is pretty wild. So what the Gemara is saying over here is that a Ben Noach could be chayiv for an act of arayos with his own wife. For Bia Shel Gedarka. Amar Rava said that doesn't make any sense. Mi'ika midi di Yisrael mechayev, v'kusi mechayev. I don't understand. If a Yisrael has Bia Shel Gedarka with his wife, again, he's not chayev. In fact, the Torah brings down, we've seen this Rasha before, Mishkevei Isha. Torah recognizes that there are two forms of Bia. There's Bia Kedarka, Bia Shel Gedarka. So for a Yisrael, it's recognized, but for a Kusi, it's going to go ahead and become literally again a form of arayos. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava, Ben Noach sheba ishes chavero shelo kidarka pater. Rather, Rava says like this. What it means is like this. A Ben Noach who has relations with his friend's wife, right? I guess they're not friends anymore. Right? Remember again, right? With his fellow's wife, right? Shelo kidarka pater. So this is fascinating, right? So Bia Shelo Kidarka in an adulterous scenario for Ben Noach is going to be pater. My taima beishto v'lo be'eshes chavero. So again, that's the prohibition of adultery, right? You can cling to your own wife, not to someone else's wife. V'dovak. Again, v'dovak. What does it mean to cling to one's wife? Dovak means normative bia, v'lo shelo kedarka, and ultimately again not bia shelo kedarka. I will say so. That's really fascinating. Now again, interestingly enough, that still may result in a kula by Bnei Noach, because by Jews that's not the case, right? An adulteress bia shelo kedarka will still be an act of adultery. But it's fascinating to see that by a Ben Noach, bia shelo kedarka, right, may not be considered adultery. Quite fascinating. If an Ovei Kochav, a non-Jew, hits a Jew, he's Chayim Misa. Shneimar, Vayifen kol vakol, Vayar ki ein ish, Vayach es ha-mitzri. So we'll say, this is quite beautiful. It learns that from Moshe Rabbeinu. Right? Then Moshe Rabbeinu, again, he saw the Egyptian taskmaster striking the Jew. He turned this way, he turned that way. He saw that there was no one around. And what did he do? He killed the Egyptian. So from here, the Gemara says, you see that Moshe Rabbeinu felt that the Egyptian was Chayiv Misa because he was striking a Jew. So a Gentile strikes a Jew is Chayiv Misa. We'll say the Gemara is off over here and says, it's so beautiful. So the Gemara says, V'am Rabbi Chanina, hasoter lo shal Yisrael, kilu soter lo shal Shechina. If one strikes the mouth of a Yid, of a Jew, it's as if he has struck the mouth of the Ribono Shel Olam. If you take a look at Rashi, Shene'emar Mokesh Adam Yala Kodesh. If you take a look at Rashi, it's 3 lines on the wide lines. Mokesh Adam Yala Kodesh. Hanokesh Esa Adam Hainu Yisrael Shekrin Adam Tichsev Ve'etnet Soni Tzomar Isi Adam Atem Yala Kodesh. Kilu Loa Esa Kodesh Kilomar Kisosra Alao. That one who strikes a Jew on the mouth is literally again as if he has struck the Shechina itself on the mouth. So we'll say, what's the pshat with that? So first I'll just understand the crowning gift that the Ribono Shel Olam has given us is the gift of speech. Right? When the pasuk says Vayipach ba'apav ruach chaim, Kadosh Baruch Hu breathed life into us. Unkelos says, what's life? Ruach memalala. Speech. That's life. So again, one goes ahead and strikes a yid on the mouth. It's as if they're striking the Shechina on the mouth itself, which Rabbi tells us that our greatest Kedusha comes from our mouth. Our greatest Kedusha comes from the words that we say, whether it's words of Torah, whether it's words of Tefillah, whether it's words of encouragement, words of praise, words of pick-me-up, words of chizik that we give to the other. The Kedusha that we can go ahead and create in this world through our mouth. You know, sometimes we just said before that chesed sometimes means giving up something that you're entitled to. Maybe you're entitled to make a sarcastic comment. Maybe you're entitled to make a cynical comment. But you withhold yourself from doing so. You use your mouth, bikdusha ubitara, that is mamish the highest level of divine emulation. The mouth of the Jew is kiviyachal like the mouth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We'll have to stop over here for today. Shkoyach, everyone. Incredible daf. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone.
Questions.
This.
Can we talk to this?
As long as nothing's halacha l'maisa.
No, none of it's l'maisa. This is purely like a litfish just trying to understand the lima.
That's what's going on over here. And no tachlin today.
Yes, no tachlin today.
Was a good Dr. Roberts here also.
Yesterday.
Yeah, no, he doesn't have Shabbat Roberts.
It's a good doc for him today. Also got clean to his.
That's right.
For a second marriage, it's 3 days already for a second marriage. You don't say tachlin for some reason.